Hello, and welcome to my debate with Jason Burns on the two questions: Did Jesus rise from the dead, and does this prove God exists? I will be presenting three arguments in defense of my answer to these questions, but before I do, I want to give an overview of why historians must regulate some stories into myth, and what things we would require for those myths to be considered real versus just mythological stories. Historians assume that what we can observe and test and see today is the way things were yesterday and the day before, and so on and so forth. So, for example, if a story is found that says a man flew, and there's no description of any machine that helped that man to fly, we regulate that story into myth or fiction. It's something somebody made up. Perhaps a small or large group of people believed that that particular man could in fact fly, but based on all our current ideas and knowledge, we've never seen a man fly, therefore it's a myth. What we would require for that myth to become an actual story is for some empirical evidence to be uncovered that gave us reasons to think that this man did in fact fly, or some sort of test that could be used to determine how this myth is different from every other myth that we have on file. For example, Hinduism has a wide variety of different myths regarding their different deities and a creation story. How do we differentiate that particular set of myths from this particular myth of the man flying? If there was some sort of test that we could do that showed one is real, whereas the other is still mythology, then we could apply that test and find out which myths are myths and which myths are real, if any at all. Without empirical evidence or some sort of test, all we would be left with, at best, would be a logically coherent argument. Somebody could, in theory, come along and make a logically coherent argument that this particular man was able to fly, and we would have to stand by that argument as being logically valid if it was, in fact, logically valid. But logic by itself doesn't get us to the truth. We need to look to science to do that, because science studies the real world. Often mythology is said to be something that science cannot test because mythology contains elements of the supernatural realm that cannot, by definition, be tested because it is beyond the natural. But without a test, what do we have? Do we have any empirical evidence of a supernatural realm? If not, what is the argument for it? And if we don't have a logically coherent argument, then we don't have anything at all. Even if we did have a logically coherent argument for the supernatural realm or for this flying man, we could still be skeptical that this is true because we lack the first two things: empirical evidence or a test. But we would have to stand by the argument as being logically valid, which means that it's possible, at least, that a man could fly. My opponent has to give us a logically coherent argument so that I can think that it is possible that there's a God and that it is possible that Jesus rose from the dead. It will be up to my opponent to produce such an argumentation, although if he could provide empirical evidence or some sort of test, he might not need an argumentation at all. So then, let me address these two questions. 1. Did Jesus rise from the dead? And 2. Does this prove God exists? My answer to both is no. Argument 1. There is probably no empirical evidence to allow us to think that Jesus is anything more than a myth. Premise 1. There is probably no test to show that the Jesus myth is actual rather than mythological. Premise 2. There is probably no empirical evidence to allow us to think that Jesus did any of the things that he was written to have done, and to allow us to think that Jesus is anything more than mythological. Premise 3. There is probably no logically coherent argument for Jesus dying and coming back to life. Conclusion. If we lack empirical evidence and a test, or a logically coherent argument, then we have no good reason to think that Jesus is anything more than a myth. Argument 2. There is probably nothing to allow us to think God is anything more than a construct of our brains. Premise 1. There is probably no empirical evidence that God is an actual entity. Premise 2. There is probably no test that we could perform to learn anything about God. Premise 3. There is probably no logically coherent argument for God. Conclusion: if we lack empirical evidence or a test or a logically coherent argument, then we have no good reason to think that God is anything more than a construct of our brains. Argument 3. There is no reason to think that a miracle is an actual event. Premise 1. Miracles cannot be tested, nor do they leave any evidence behind. Premise 2. When we see an event and we have no ready explanation for it, to say that it is a miracle is to invoke special knowledge of that event. Premise 3. Every so-called miracle event we have tested has turned out to have a natural explanation for it. Conclusion: there is no reason to think that a miracle is an event at all. We are unable to test it. To identify it requires a logical fallacy to be invoked, meaning we have to be instantly skeptical of such an event. And finally, anytime we have tested them, they've turned out to be normal events. And now for additional explanations of my argumentations. Argument 3 illustrates the problem of a death and resurrection being explained as a miracle. Even if we were presented with some sort of argument that Jesus did in fact exist and came back from the dead, we could not say that it was a miracle that only God could explain, for doing that would require one proof that that's the only explanation. Another argument that we do not yet have, and also that the miracle thing is a real thing. Without any of those argumentations, we can't assume or put into place an explanation for something that we don't have an explanation for. In other words, a mystery cannot be answered by invoking a special knowledge claim. If my door opens and closes by itself, I am not allowed to say a ghost did it. I simply do not know why it happened or how it happened. To suggest that X event is explained by Y mysterious thing when Y mysterious thing has not itself been argued for and or explained to be a thing is to invoke a special knowledge claim. My first two argumentations are presented in a probabilistic argument format so that my opponent has a chance to produce one of the three requirements to make us not be skeptical of his conclusions. If my opponent can produce empirical evidence, a test, or a logically coherent argument, then he can shed doubt on my first two argumentations, and I would have to readdress them or concede those points. My third argument is a deductive argument, and my opponent must refute it either by showing its logic to be invalid or by giving his own stronger argument and counterexamples to my argument. If he cannot or will not, it would stand unrefuted. This concludes my opening argumentation to these two questions. I look forward to listening to my opponent's opening argument, and I thank you for listening.